All right, let's get going. So if we look towards physics, which is of course the paradigmatic example of a mature science that has model, theory, and data analysis, it seems to me that things there are moving between two poles in terms of the ability to use theory and to use modeling. On the one hand, you have one of the all-time success stories, I think, of in the history of science, which is in November 1915 in Berlin, where Albert Einstein derived his general theory of relativity. And the first prediction he made, and he talks about it in his biography, and it's very vivid because then he knew he was right, is then, of course, there was this puzzling dilemma that Newton's theory didn't explain the shift, the systematic shift over a century in the perihelion, in the orbit, the orbit of Mercury, which amounts to something like 40 arc seconds. So that's less than an arc minute, and of course there's 60 arc minutes in an arc degree. So it's really tiny, 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 but it's a consistent shift. And his theory managed to predict that. So he did a calculation, he approximated his equation, did an approximation, and found the actual observed value. So that's a spectacular case. On the other hand, we have what we heard already from Gaute. We have modern weather prediction, which is sort of physics, that keep on improving. So he mentioned the one statistic that every decade we get 1 day, we can predict 1 day further out at the same level of accuracy. Another measure is that the spatial uncertainty between the landfall, where people predict a hurricane will land and its actual landfall, which is of course a critical value. You know, if you're a governor of, let's say, South Carolina, you need to evacuate your population. That spatial uncertainty keeps on going, halving every 6 years. So again, that's spectacular. Now, if we turn to all of our chosen field, which is neuroscience, the best instance of something like that is 1950 and 1951, where Hodgkin and Huxley, using a handheld, most of you don't know this, it's a handheld calculator. You can see it in Paul Allen's Museum of Computer, right, where they derived the model for a single patch of squid axon, the action potential models, in terms of its pure phenomenology, and then they wrote down a nonlinear differential equation, the cable equation for the actual cable, the extended squid axon, and over many weeks they had to crank to do one simulation. We're not talking about billions of minutes. We're talking about one simulation, and the value they got after 3 weeks, the propagation, which is what they wanted to come out, that the action potential propagates at the known speed, was within 10% of the measured value. Now that's freaking awesome. And wow. I don't know anything. Now this is 51. Right? Today is 2019. I don't know really anything. I mean, maybe one of you can mention it. All right, so I'm going to come to the question. And then I'd like to read you a short story. Okay, I'm going to read a short story. Some of you may know it because actually it's in the textbook that Julie and Rob Phillips wrote, Physical Biology of the Cell. It's called On Exactitude in Science. It's by Jorge Luis Borges, okay, the Argentinian writer. This is from his collected fictions. So it's a short story. And this is my nightmare, okay? In that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire the entirety of a province. In time, those maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that such a vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness was it that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of sun and winters. In the desert of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there is no other relic of the discipline of geography. Right? I think it's quite a nice story and serves well as the first question that I wanted to ask. So So obviously we are learning more and more. We have better tools, and everything is getting better. But sort of where each one of you, and maybe we can start here and then go over there on this spectrum from really simple models that actually where a human being can understand and can at least reproduce the action of another human being, albeit an exceptional one like Albert Einstein. And the other case where we can simulate everything in incredible detail, but we don't understand everything because only the supercomputer simulation understands.
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's important. I mean, it also leads to the question, at what point can you really say that you understand something? I mean, it has been said that I only understand what I can model, but it doesn't go the other way around. What I can model, I necessarily understand. And yeah, if you have too much detail, there's the danger that you haven't really learned anything. And so you need simplification. And I feel there's two types of simplification. There is the conceptual one, the one that is kind of genius, where you have an idea. Suddenly you have a theory about how something works that allows you to simplify, find a new concept, a new high-level concept that explains something. And then there is more systematic simplification where you take away parameters from a more complicated system and see if it breaks down or does it still work. And I think those two have to go hand in hand because the genius simplification is also a danger. You want to have a model of how birds fly, and I can say I have a really good model of how birds fly, and I simplify away gravity. That of course works. It will fly in the model, but it won't help. It also won't help you. And so you have to also make sure that your genius model does not violate the more detailed model. That it still works in that context. But yeah, so I think we just need many different approaches, and eventually, hopefully, knowledge will be distilled from that process.
Can I continue?
I think I drew that in my slide. I had the computation, high-dimensional model, low-dimensional model. I think those three pieces are exactly, and I think we need all three of them to come together to constitute full understanding. Doesn't mean that any one of those arrows doesn't constitute understanding, but a complete understanding, I think, means filling in the whole thing.
But in practice, I mean, in principle, we can all agree with the high-dimensional model. Are we talking about a trillion-dimensional model? There are 10 to the 12 neurons in the human brain. They each have 10 to the 11 proteins, right? If we wanted, that's a mole of molecules that we need to model, if not more, right? Is that the right level? Is that a high-dimensional? And then the low-dimensional is an X and a Y plane?
Well, for one thing, I think already we have, in terms of the neurons and Hodgkin-Huxley, we were quite lucky in the sense that we're able to represent all the ion channels that what we need in order to model neural dynamics in terms of this very quite simplified models where you sort of have to fit the parameters. So you don't have to worry about all this, the proteins going through the membrane and so on. So sometimes we are lucky, so there's a limited amount of detail that we have to sort of bring in from the lower level. But the way I think about this detailed model and why I'm so interested in spending my limited bandwidth on that, at least for the foreseeable future, is that I'm not quite sure whether if you do this, start with the simplified models, and which explains some phenomena. I'm not quite sure how to make progress with them. I mean, they're cute, but it's and nice and useful, but I'm not quite sure how relevant they turn out to be. And I think it was like a covert to sort of said earlier today the usefulness. If I had some people even in the field are worried about what if you sort of am able to make like a model for a cortical circuit, and it's very, very complicated, but exactly mimics the data, what have you learned. It would be like the ideal, experimental system, right, where you can sort of change everything. Talking about optogenetics, we can change some groups, whatever. But this would here you can change everything. So this would be like a fantastic starting point for analysis, and then starting to derive simplified models. So that's sort of, I think the first thing you have to make sure that you are sort of compatible with experiments, and like so that this is so that it's and start simplifying from there. I'm not saying that everybody should do this, but I mean it's like we are so few success stories, I would say, like in network neuroscience, that I root for everyone who tries to make an effort, no matter what sort of, if it's like following certain rules. So that's quite clear that the approach I want to pursue is the best one. But I think, at least for me, sort of to make sure that there's some contact between experiments and your model.
I agree with the, how to say, interface between, modeling and the experiment is very important. But I prefer to start with the simple models. Yeah, because, in neuroscience, I coming from the, how to say, molecular biology and the biochemistry. So I feel neuroscientists quite, how to say, fall in love in the, how to say, circuit. Not the molecule or molecular property, but sometimes, for example, frequency property is coming from not from the circuit, but from the molecular properties. So therefore, I prefer to start with the simple models and then test what property can be explained by the simple model, and if it cannot, how to say, explain some feature, and then we add up the, how to say, circuit, for example. Yeah, that's my opinion.
It seems to me like we have, at opposite ends of the spectrum, two different simplicities, if you like. At one end, if we start with neurons or ion channels, we have ingredients that we can explain fairly easily to people, but when we put them together, we end up with a model that's fiendishly complicated to compute with, with millions of ingredients combined. At the other end of the spectrum, we have models that are relatively simple with only modest number of equations, but the entities we're working with are much more abstract and difficult to explain to people what they really mean in terms of the brain. So it seems to me that we need to have a hierarchy of models, or a ladder of models, that link these two ends of the spectrum together. And in physics, we have like ladders with just a couple of steps. So we have at the micro scale stuff like molecular dynamics and atomic physics, and we understand those models quite well in statistical mechanics. And then we build on those, and we go up to a level of description to things like continuum mechanics, properties of materials in the average, thermodynamics. And we understand those higher level models in terms of the lower level models, and we don't come to design an aircraft or something by doing molecular dynamics calculations of the airflow. We first of all justify the fluid mechanics of aerodynamics, and then we apply that to the wing. So I think in neuroscience we're going to need several levels, several rungs on our ladder to link these things together. But and I think that's going to take quite a bit of time to develop. And each rung will have a set of phenomena that it's the most appropriate to work with.
So I think, so first of all, I agree with this sentiment that has been expressed that multiple levels of resolution are valuable, I would even say necessary. And that's certainly true. Then second, it really depends on the question that we want to ask. And some things just absolutely require molecular level resolution, but perhaps do not require a scientist to do that in such a way that you have to simulate the whole brain at that level of resolution, right? So you could use very fine resolution, but limit yourself to a small part of the system. A lot of the problems could be solved that way. On the other hand, some kind of whole brain phenomena probably can be described by some of the approaches like what Peter, for example, presented today. But if I were to make a stand or make a bet as to what is going to be the approach that's most fruitful, let's say, in the next couple decades for critical questions, at least in my opinion, some of the most interesting questions, which is what are the fundamental principles of how the brain processes the information, and in terms of potential applications of models, let's say to start contributing to medicine. If I were to make a bet as to where this sort of what level of resolution would be most fruitful, I would think that would be level of individual neurons and the model scale of a whole brain. That's what I want to see happening in the next couple of decades. Whole brain modeled, and we can consider neurons as points, but let's have them represented at that level.
Can I channel John Krakauer for a moment? Which so John would completely laugh at all of us, right, for trying to do modeling at anything like this level. When I think that the piece that we're all leaving out of these discussions is behavior, right? Is the goal of the system and what it's trying to do. We don't understand psychology at all, right? So we have no overarching idea of why the animal is doing what it's doing in response to the things that it's experiencing. And so we don't know what is the representation that we're trying to capture, right? So we can do the physics, and I think we've seen just great examples where the physics tells us about these sort of slow phenomenon or large-scale behavior across the surface of the brain, and that's incredibly impressive. What it's missing, or where we would like to go next, right, is trying to understand the fine, detailed structure that's actually carrying out the thinking, the computations, right? This is sort of default modes and things like that, and that's very powerfully a place where physics maybe is the right approach. How do we marry that with carrying out algorithms? And what are those algorithms trying to represent? What are the variables of the algorithms? Where are they in this circuit? And how do we can't get there from physics, right?
Wouldn't you sort of say, if you have this, I think you raised this very important point, and how do we get algorithms from networks? But wouldn't be that the way to test, if you have this idea about an algorithm, that's something that something that happening, say, in the mouse V1, then I would sort of like challenge you, say, well, how can you modify this V1 model to try to implement it there? And I would still call that physics, right? I mean, it's just like another way it's like another way to tune the parameter. You don't necessarily, you can tune the parameters towards doing a particular function, right, also? So, I mean, it's...
where you put in the algorithm, I would say I mean, this is semantics, but,
But you would put it into the synapses, right,
physics.
probably.
Is it trying to do inference? If so, that's not just simply an input to output transformation where you drive something and it cascades through a series of differential equations, right? You have to have built your differential equations or have them emerge in a way that carries out that algorithm. And without you having done that or allowed the system to train itself to do that, where will that come from?
No, but I think but still at the end of the day, it's going to implement the circuits, right? So it's...
The brain is a physical object, right?
Yeah,
so you have to be able to write
I
down
don't think necessarily, I don't see there's like necessarily, but I think it's a question of sort of, I mean, obviously, at the end of the day, it would be wonderful to have like a brain model and attached to a body and interact in an environment but I mean, if you sort of look at Hodgkin Huxley, right, they figured out the axon with like this one nerve in their lab,
where
right?
Physics is
so it's also a question of what can you
right.
sort of learn about, for example, about if the cortical column is like a building block, which then is used later to sort of tune together with the rest of the brain to do to make the animal survive. So I guess it's a question, how do you study, and you also have to be practical, right? I mean, it would be very difficult if all neuroscience had to be do with sort of like animals out in the wild environment. I mean, it would be very difficult starting points. You have to have some hope that you can learn something.
So when do you think we'll be able, in the following situation right now, if you look at the DSM-5, which is the standard way how mental diseases are diagnosed here, there's not a single diagnostic criteria, there's not a single mental illness that uses, for example, fMRI. So if I'm depressed, if I want to kill myself, if I hear voices, if I'm a paranoid schizophrenic, do not go in a magnetic scanner because it's going to be useless. So the question is, what is more likely to happen first? A deep machine learning network where I go in a scanner and the scanner tells me, yes, this patient with 99% probability is going to have a schizophrenic episode of the next day, or a model, however built, a detailed neural network model, that has whiz-bang, Hodgkin, Huxley, cortical columns, whatever you want, that can tell me, yes, this person is probably undergoing a schizophrenic episode. What do you think is more likely?
Statistics, obviously. Probably Google can do that now by looking at the way you're typing.
Probably very close.
But it does already.
Yeah.
Facebook, no.
I wouldn't
Well,
be
for
surprised.
instance, yes, statistic evaluation, Facebook may know. Now that's scary. I mean, it's
But they don't know
scary.
why.
It's scary for a number of reasons. Of course, for the political implication, but also scary to me as a scientist, because our model of understanding is that, I can sit and read a book and think about it and then really, that's how it works. But it may not be the case for really, if we're talking about 10 to the, big brains like us that have 10 to the 10, 10 to the 11 components, that we may never get to that understanding, that ultimately it's just going to be some deep neural network that says, well, this is going to happen, or this is probably going to happen.
But I mean that's not the. I mean that's not the only thing you want the model to do. Maybe it's not the most interesting.
No, I don't. But
because I think, for example, if you look at schizophrenia, if you want to, because that seems to be like maybe like a circuit disease. It's not something you can sort of look see in a scanner. Not even Google can see that in a scanner. Right? There must be some data in there, maybe on the way you type. But anyway, if you want to sort of get to that, I think you sort of have to. You can be lucky, of course, and find a drug. But if you want to understand the disease, I think with circuit diseases, you have to be able to understand how circuits work. And
deep brain stimulation works perfectly well to help 150,000 Parkinson patients. There's no understanding of the detailed biophysics and circuit level why stimulating subthalamic nucleus at 140 hertz, but not 110 hertz and not 170 hertz works.
Why are pharmaceuticals are leaving psychiatry? The last drug was like in the 50s, where you had like antipsychotics. So I mean, it's not, and this after all, deep brain stimulation is a very blunt thing which takes away the shaking, which is sort of like it's one of the more delicate things like schizophrenia, which is sort of like you think in the wrong way. Is you need something much more. I would guess with Alzheimer we could be lucky because that's a molecule thing, so it's like a hardware thing. But I think with some of these sort of like psychiatric diseases, we need to understand more of the circuit.
Regarding schizophrenia, so you said circuit problem, but that is a kind of a bias, right? Kind of a neuroscientist bias.
What is a bias? That you
circuit? Yeah, you assume the circuit. Yeah, of course, phenotype is coming from circuit, but as I show you today, NMDA receptor inhibitor are known to induce a schizophrenic, positive symptom and negative symptom. That is the just suppression of the, one molecules. Yeah. So, and then calcium is
all molecules.
All molecule. Yeah. And then, no. Okay. So I take a part. Okay. But and then calcium is is usually correlated with the neural excitation. But as I said, calcium seems to be suppressing the neural activity. So therefore, if you suppress the neural activity, most cortex neurons are highly excited, including excitatory neuron and the inhibitory neurons. And then excitatory neuron activation might be related to positive symptom, and then inhibitory neuron activation might be related to negative symptom, which is a little bit difficult to treat. So therefore, I think we start with the simple fact, and then try to look at the phenomena try to avoid some kind of bias. That's my opinion.
But I think when it comes to schizophrenia, if you look at these genome-wide association studies, this for one thing, it's like lots of genes involved,
right.
And it codes for everything, development, synapses. So it would be, I think and there's also a big environmental like component, whether you get it or not. So I don't know, but I think we would be very lucky with the present level of understanding if we can sort of cure schizophrenia and find cures for it and bipolar disorders, and especially these polygenic diseases.
Yeah, right. But so you said Facebook and then Google can say something on the schizophrenia, but it cannot predict. So you can say that is
No, it may well be able to predict on the search term. If I track your search history, you know, it may well be able to predict.
But do you think? But do you think Facebook?
Surprise.
A lot of data.
But do you think,
Okay,
do you think
okay.
Facebook?
They're
Do you,
using projects now.
Okay.
I'll tell you about it.
do you think Facebook can curate also?
No.
That's way very more interesting. I
Your
think.
side, okay.
Then I wanted to ask a question that was asked this morning by Andrew McCulloch in the first panel, which I really liked because I thought it gave rise to some very interesting answers, which is, you know, if the triumvirate of data, models, and theory, where do the various, you know, you all take different approaches to understanding the bridge, where do you come down to, you know, if you really could do one thing, would you emphasize more data, which is of course always good, but more theory is always good, and more models is also good. So where are the trade-offs?
I think we're very theory lacking right now, and the kind of big picture, top-down theory, and it's because it's hard. It's really hard. And you know, I gave that list, right, of what I think are the big T theories for the last 50 years, and it's one slide worth. We
It was 2.
maybe 2, right? So we're, you know, we're very limited. And I think even the classic theories, reinforcement learning, this kind of thing, haven't really been validated in any neural systems. They're very suggestive. It helps us to interpret some kinds of data, but when you look more deeply, those correspondences aren't quite as neat as they're made out to be. We need more ideas.
Most of those theories date from the last century, right? The ones you showed.
Yeah, maybe some within the last 20 years, but nothing new.
Yeah, I think we're in a situation where we don't have enough interplay between theory and experiment. I mean, we've seen the interplay at this meeting, but in general in the field there's not enough interplay. And I think that's historically because the problems have been historically far too hard for the theories to cope with. And it's only now the theories are starting to get to interesting problems and be able to tackle them. And so hopefully that will engage the experimentalists and set up this virtual cycle like we have in physics, where theorists and experimentalists talk to each other, theories motivate experiments, experiments motivate theoretical developments and test the theories, and both sides advance more quickly. I think we have at the moment the mirror image of what's the situation in, say, string theory in physics, where there's a huge amount of theory and almost no data to test it. And here we have a huge amount of data, and the theories are at a relatively basic level, hardly able to explain any of the data for all their advances. And it would be good to get to the more healthy situation that prevails in much of physics and chemistry and so forth, where the two are more balanced.
So I think, again, all three are very, very important. And, you know, whenever any of us is trying to take a stand and say, well, this is this one out of the three, we run the risk of alienating other people who care about the rest. And I certainly think all three are very important. But since we are asked to take a stand, again, I personally think we are really data-starved. There are a lot of data around there, but I think we do need more. We really, the brain is very complex, and we barely starting to scratch the surface of what is it made of and how things are connected to each other. You know, this exercise that we did of building the model of V1, there's just so many unknowns there. We don't know how things talk within V1. We don't know what kind of inputs V1 receives. You know, it's like you come to a new continent and you know a couple of islands on at the edge of it, and the rest is totally white map. That's how I feel. But another important point here is this is not just the data. I think I will echo something that Markus Kovert said earlier today. It's not just the data. The data have to be curated. Yes. They have to be provided in such a way that you can actually use it. And it has to be quality controlled. So that's where my vote would be.
I would like, maybe this is an idea for the Allen Institute for the next, is I would like plasticity rules. This is really what is missing in the core. I mean, I think all this parameter fitting that we're struggling with, because that's, I mean, is something, because unlike, and when if you talked about the chemical modeling before, before lunch. I mean, there the parameters are not changing over time in connection, like rate constants or stuff. They are fixed, but in our parameters are changing over time, conductances. So there are these plasticity rules that regulates the transcription of ion channels. So if it's like a massive effort to map out the synaptic plasticity rules between different types of neurons in the mouse V1 cortex, and also homeostatic plasticity rules. How does a bursting neuron know that it's a bursting neuron? How does it keep it a bursting neuron even if something bad to happen to one of the ion channels? So I think that will make the modeling world much life easier for modelers, because you will have self-tuning networks. But then of course you need a bit more computer power. But that's probably going to happen. So plasticity rules.
Okay.
Blake Richards has a provocative point of view that the plasticity rules themselves will end up constituting the theory. You just take a network, you give me the plasticity rules, you run it, it will form whatever it wants to do. And because I've told you the plasticity rule, I'm kind of done. I've done my job. I'm curious what you guys think about that.
I agree, it's data. There is a lot of data, but the problem is that it's often contradictory. You just go to a neighboring region and suddenly the rules are totally different, or the data is very different, or just you take a different cell type in the same region and you get different data, different rules, which might indicate that for this phenomenon you're just not measuring at the right level, which again goes to the question of at what level should you model. And for example, in terms of plasticity rules, that is the problem. Different neuron types, you get different plasticity rules. In this region, they look like this. For different cell type, they look like this. We currently work on something that's trying a little bit to solve it in just going to a more detailed level, finding that at least some differences between plasticity rules between different neurons can be explained by a simpler unifying model that is simply based on calcium influx, showing that just by going to a lower level, you don't need many different rules. And so in this case, it is the model indicating at what level you need to be for the data, showing that it's all linked. And then once you have the rules, probably you get the theory. So I don't think it's like a knot that you have to untie by tying a little bit here, which is loosening it a little bit here, allowing you to tear out that part of the thread, and then here, and then here, and then here. And I think that's how we untangle. It's all linked.
Rocky?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I mean, plasticity rule is missing, and then especially plasticity rule within the cells, and then plasticity rule among the cell. But in terms of the intercellular plasticity rule, I think, long-term connection is rule for that long-term connection, long-range connection is missing. Yeah, so for example, short-range connection can be well explained by the LTP, LDP, BCM or STDP, or other rule. But long time scale as well as long range connection, plasticity rule is missing. So I'd like to see, such kind of a rule will be formed, maybe through the Allen Brain Institute, or maybe from some, yeah.
For the next,
yeah.
For the future. We have to draw to a close. I wanted to ask you all a relatively simple, that in principle has a simple answer. So we live in a very exciting age, not only politically, but also scientifically and technologically. Yeah. And it is quite likely that in the lifetime of some of us, certainly the younger ones, we will have systems like Alexa in the year 2050, or Siri or Cortana, whatever, that mimic and rival human in their intelligence, and possibly even their super intelligence. Right? I mean, this is a development that many people have talked about. It will happen, no question about sooner and later, and I think it'll happen, as I said, in the lifetime of some of us. Whether that's good or bad, it's a different question. And so that's one. You can say that's one way to understand humans, by being able to mimicking humans and humans' creativity and human dialogue and having a conversation with them, and they can crack jokes and just act like, pass the Turing test, do all of that sort of stuff. On the other hand, we're trying to understand humans. Let's just talk about normal, healthy people. From a bottom up, right? Trying to use various biophysics and anatomy. It's an avowed aim of the Brain Initiative. They have a big emphasis on human neuroscience, because ultimately we don't just want to understand worms and flies and mice, but human. So who's going to understand people at first? Are we first going to have perfect models that are indistinguishable, at least from a human? When you talk to them on the phone, you don't know anymore, is it Alexa 2050 or is it my grandchild? Or is it going to be the human brain simulation that missed by 10 years, but it's doing it in 50 years, and it's going to be able to understand and simulate humans? What do you think?
Of course, engineered systems are going to get there much faster than brain models. I mean, I think you're almost facetiously asking that, perhaps, because you cannot think otherwise, right? We're seeing that coming down the pike at us very fast now. I mean, what I guess the middle ground is that why it's coming so fast is that those models are using principles that they are being inspired by from brains, and that has been a fundamental change. And I think it's real, and it will continue to draw inspiration from whatever we're learning, and will continue to get better because different plasticity rules will be applied, better ways of training, the kinds of flexibility, long-term dynamics. I mean, even this, advance of LSTM, right? Putting memory into networks has given them all kinds of powers that now make the kinds of things that networks can do so much richer. And I think that will be the route to getting general AI is gaining inspiration from biological systems that we will provide to them. I'm not sure it will come via the route of the very detailed simulations, though.
Do you all agree with this assessment?
I'd agree largely with that. I mean, I always think of the analogy with flight. Aircraft initially were very rudimentary, then they became very good at flying very fast, but they're not very good at doing what bumblebees do, hovering around flowers and so forth. And it's only relatively recently we've understood those things. And still there's a huge area of science that legitimately inquires into how birds fly, how different kinds of insects fly. And there are still new discoveries being made that are informing micro drones and so forth. So I think they're parallel things. And I see Alexa and so forth becoming very good at a certain subset of things we do pretty soon. But in terms of general intelligence, it's going to be a lot further off. But it will happen, almost certainly.
So I think, let's say it happens. Let's say we have this general intelligent AI that is superhuman in its abilities. I don't see necessarily a discrepancy between us as human understanding human brain better and the superhuman AI understanding human brain better. Because of course there are scenarios where AI goes rogue and humans are extinct. But if this is done well,
oops.
Yeah, exactly. But if this is done well, then we will be the masters of AI. If it understands something, we will ask it, and it will tell us, and then we will understand it, or at least we will be able to leverage that knowledge. I mean, imagine scientists, now a graduate student is sitting there in front of a computer and doing all the hard work themselves. Instead, they will have 100 AI assistants that will do all the dirty work for them, and they will get the glorious knowledge.
Well, and the AI will just say, I don't understand how I work. We have to build a bigger AI.
I think there's like some. What does it mean to understand something, right? And I think it's obviously already today Alexa is sort of faking to be human almost, right? I mean, it's like how do you train something to fake to sound like a human? And there's some. So it's a very But I guess the question, if you want to sort of make something that appears human, you should certainly use machine learning and stuff like that, not start with. But I'm not sure. I mean, we sometimes, if you sort of look at the number of genes in the mouse and in the humans, it's not that different, right? I mean, it's
the same.
It's the same, right? So, so that's something we have this feeling that it's easier to understand C. elegans because there's 300 and whatever 50 neurons, but their genome is also much larger relative to the number of neurons. So meaning I think it's so it's probably in C. elegans, each neuron have to be exactly like it is. In humans and in mice and even more in humans, it's more learning rules that sets up there. So we could be very lucky to that actually if you understand the cortex and extract some principles from that from like a mouse cortex, and then sort of so I'm more optimistic towards sort of like understanding. I mean, to be able to make like plausible simulations of human-sized brains, and if we just, I think the limitation, just like a human to get life, the big, like making unicell, I mean, what's it called, single cell life, turn out that took only a few 100 million years after the Earth was born, and then from there to multicell life, that took like. Billions of years. And then, but then once they got the hang of that, they sort of like this Cambrian explosion, right? It was like animals all over the place. And maybe it's the same thing. If you just crack what a cortex does, a piece of cortex does, then you sort of, it's more of the same. Sort of like it's quantum mechanics. When you figure out how to model hydrogen, that was like helium was done like the month after. I mean, it was like it's like much, and it's like the same principle. So, but whether that is going to be a model that is like practical in order to fake sort of to being human, like this general artificial, but that's not really what I'm after in that context either.
So top-down approach, like AI, is quite powerful, and then it's how to say. Will succeed, but still, I'd like to understand ourselves, or I'd like to understand how to say sleep or wake or even consciousness, and then which may be solved not from AI but from the how to say investigation of the brain itself. And then what is missing for the bottom-up approach is how to say. So today I presented the gene of the week approach, right? So to make a how to say knockout mice every week, but what is missing is gene of the cells approach. So we cannot, we cannot how to say perturb particular cell type and then to look at the cell every week, right? So especially in mammals. So if we achieved the gene of the cell. Yeah. Cell of the week. Yeah, cell of the week. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, cell
in the animal, where each week you perturb a different cell type.
Yeah, so in that case, maybe we can achieve.
We would like that.
Yeah. So please, so we can collaborate maybe, yeah. So because, knock-in mice, how to say, to make a knock-in mice very easily, maybe we can do that. But what is totally missing right now? So because if you want to make a knock-in mice, it takes usually 1 to 2 years, not a week, right? So therefore, I'd like to understand ourselves, which requires bottom-up approach, which requires some missing how to say technology. Yeah.
I guess where's the bottom of that bottom up is the case where you need to decide.
All right, with that, I'd like to thank all speakers, all panelists. I'd like to thank Kathy for organizing and Marcus for organizing this wonderful symposium this afternoon. Thank you very much.